November 1943, RAF Sherburn-in-Elmet, Yorkshire. A supercharged 4.5-litre Bentley, rumoured to be a Blower Bentley from the Le Mans racing era, tears across a military airfield. Behind it, dragged by a tow cable, is a standard Willys MB Jeep. Bolted to the Jeep's roof is a 40-foot rotor. Strapped to its rear is a streamlined tail with twin vertical fins. As the Bentley accelerates past 45 miles per hour, the rotor begins to spin. The wheels lift off the grass and the Jeep flies. Not metaphorically, the thing is actually airborne, and the man gripping the control column from the passenger seat is wondering what on earth he has agreed to. This was the Hafner Rotabuggy, the Malcolm Rotaplane, the ML-1042 flying Jeep, and before you laugh, it worked. The problem the Rotabuggy was designed to solve was brutally simple. Paratroopers landed on foot. They scattered across wide drop zones, carrying only what they could strap to their bodies. Once on the ground, they had no vehicles, no way to tow anti-tank guns, no way to move ammunition in bulk, no way to evacuate casualties quickly, no way to consolidate scattered units before the enemy could react. And the enemy knew this. German doctrine for countering airborne landings relied on rapid armoured counterattack in the first hours, precisely because paratroopers lacked anti-tank capability and ground mobility. A lone paratrooper with a Sten gun and a gammon bomb was brave. A paratrooper with a Jeep towing a 6-pounder anti-tank gun was dangerous. The quarter-ton Willys MB was the answer. A single Jeep could tow that 6-pounder, carry radio equipment, haul supplies, and give airborne troops the rapid ground mobility that turned a scattered drop into a cohesive fighting force. But in 1942, reliably parachuting a Jeep intact was not practical at scale. You needed to fly it in. In 1942, British options for delivering vehicles by air were limited and expensive. The airspeed Horsa glider could carry a Jeep, but each Horsa had an 88-foot wingspan, was built from wood, and was expendable. One Jeep, one flight, one destroyed glider. Large, labour-intensive, and effectively single-use. The larger General Aircraft Hamilcar could carry a 7-ton Tetrarch light tank, but it required a 4-engine Halifax bomber as a tug, and was still in its early production stages with numbers severely limited. Both gliders also needed large, flat landing zones, and both required trained glider pilots who would then be stranded on the ground as infantry. An Austrian-born engineer named Raoul Hafner saw a shortcut. The Jeep already had wheels. Why build an entire disposable aircraft around it when you could bolt a rotor and tail directly onto the vehicle itself? Hafner estimated that 7 rotabuggies could be converted for the cost of a single Horsa glider. Upon landing, the crew would detach the rotor assembly, and the Jeep would drive away immediately. No fuselage to unload, no glider to abandon. The Air Ministry agreed the concept was worth pursuing, and issued Specification 1042 in 1942 for a special rotating wing glider. Hafner was uniquely qualified for this work. Born in Vienna on September 20th, 1905, he had been experimenting with rotary wing aircraft since the late 1920s. He came to Britain in 1933 after Scottish industrialist Major Jack Coates financed shipping his experimental helicopter to Heston Aerodrome. In Britain, Hafner pivoted to autogyro design. According to Royal Aero Club records, he earned Aviator's Certificate number 11430 on September 14th, 1933. His AR-3 gyroplane, first flown in 1935, became the first aircraft in the world to successfully use cyclic pitch control. That single innovation would eventually transform helicopter design worldwide. When war broke out, Hafner was briefly interned as an enemy alien on May 12, 1940, at Maidstone Prison. Released on September 18th after gaining British citizenship, he immediately joined the central landing establishment at RAF Ringway, Manchester, developing rotary wing solutions for airborne forces. His first wartime project was the Rotor-chute, a one-man autogyro parachute designed to give individual soldiers a steerable descent instead of the uncontrollable drift of a conventional chute. The Rotor-chute used a small rotor on a backpack frame. Hafner tested it himself, being towed aloft behind a tiger moth before releasing and gliding to Earth. The Rotor-chute proved the autorotation principle worked at man-size scale. The Rotabuggy was the logical next step. If a rotor could slow and steer a falling man, a larger rotor could slow and steer a falling Jeep. The contract to build the Rotabuggy prototype went to R. Malcolm and Company Limited at White Waltham in Berkshire. This was the same firm that produced the famous Malcolm hood canopy fitted to Spitfires. Hafner's design started with a standard Willys MB Jeep weighing 964 kilograms empty. To this, his team added a rotor pylon, a streamlined tail fairing, twin vertical fins, a horizontal tailplane, and a 2-bladed rotor mounted on a rubber-damped hub. The rotor and tail assembly together weighed 249 kilograms, bringing total loaded weight to 1,411 kilograms. The rotor itself was entirely unpowered, No engine drove it. Instead, the system relied on autorotation. This is the principle that makes autogyros work, and it is counterintuitive. In a helicopter, the engine spins the rotor, and the spinning rotor pushes air downward to create lift. In an autogyro, the process is reversed. As the vehicle moves forward through the air, either under tow or during a gliding descent, airflow passes upward through the angled rotor disc. This upward airflow causes the blades to spin freely, like a windmill turned on its side. That spinning generates lift, enough lift to support the vehicle's weight and produce a controlled, steerable descent. Think of it as a sycamore seed the size of a Jeep. The blades are not powered. They're driven by the air moving through them. Design performance figures were ambitious. Maximum tow speed of 150 miles per hour, with a cruising speed of 80. The rotor diameter spanned roughly 40 feet. The rotor's primary operating speed was 230 revolutions per minute. Two men sat side by side in the open Jeep. The pilot occupied the front passenger seat, controlling the rotor via a hanging control column that descended from the overhead hub. The driver sat in the normal position, ready to manage the vehicle the moment it was safely on the ground. Before any flight testing, Hafner's team filled a Willys MB with concrete and dropped it from increasing heights. The Jeep survived falls from up to 2.35 meters without structural damage. Now, before we get into how this thing actually flew, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Right, let us get into the test flights. Construction was likely completed by mid-1943. The prototype was transported to RAF Sherburn-in-Elmet near Leeds, home of the Airborne Forces experimental establishment, known as AFEE. The first ground trial took place on November 16, 1943. A Diamond T4-ton lorry towed the Rotabuggy across the airfield, but the truck could not generate enough speed to spin the rotor fast enough for lift. 11 days later, AFEE produced a solution that belongs in a film script. On November 27, 1943, a supercharged 4.5-litre Bentley arrived at Sherburn. According to Robin Bird, whose father Bob was the Ministry of Aircraft production photographer documenting the trials, it was rumoured to be an ex-Birkin Le Mans car, one of the legendary Blower Bentleys. One story claims AFEE even logged the Bentley as an aircraft for paperwork purposes, though it was apparently never given an RAF serial number. With its rear seats removed so photographers could ride in the back, the Bentley towed the Rotabuggy at speed across the grass airfield. Squadron leader Ian Malcolm David Little sat at the control column in the Jeep's passenger seat. The Jeep became airborne, achieving glide speeds of roughly 45 miles per hour. Testing continued through the winter, plagued by severe vibration above 45 miles per hour. A heavy landing damaged the rotor blades, causing delays. By February 1st, 1944, improvements allowed the Rotabuggy to reach 70 miles per hour during ground tow tests. From June 24th, an Armstrong Whitworth Whitley bomber replaced the Bentley for higher speed ground runs while remaining on the runway itself, its engines providing far more power. The defining test came on September 11th, 1944. Squadron leader Little took the pilot's seat. Flight Lieutenant Packman, an engineering officer, sat in the driver's position. A Whitley bomber took off from Sherburn-in-Elmet with the Rotabuggy in tow behind it. The rotor spun up as the combination accelerated along the runway. The Jeep's wheels left the ground. For the first time, the Rotabuggy was in full free flight, towed behind a powered aircraft at altitude. According to Philip Jarrett's account in Aeroplane Monthly, published in 1991, the flight was harrowing. Severe vibration set in as airspeed increased. The Rotabuggy proved dangerously tail-heavy under tow, with no way to trim it out. The Whitley crew had to slow to near-stalling speed to keep the combination manageable. The Jeep reached roughly 400 feet altitude and 65 miles per hour over approximately 10 minutes of flight. According to eyewitness accounts, the Whitley landed first, while the Jeep, still attached by cable, continued bouncing through the air behind it. The audience watched as the Rotabuggy made a series of violent up-and-down pitching movements. When it finally touched down, Packman drove flat out after the slowing Whitley. According to surviving accounts from observers, nobody got out for a while once the vehicle stopped. The pilot was then assisted out and lay down beside the runway. He was reportedly exhausted from fighting the control column, which had whipped in circles for the duration of the flight. The official AFEE report, with characteristic military understatement, deemed the test highly satisfactory. The British were not the only ones trying to make military vehicles fly. The Soviets attempted something even more ambitious in 1942 with the Antonov A-40, which bolted a 59-foot biplane glider wing assembly to a T-60 light tank. The idea was that the tank crew would fly it to the battlefield, land, shed the wings, and drive straight into combat. On its single test flight on September 2, 1942, the tow aircraft's engines overheated from the enormous drag. The pilot, Sergei Anokhin, released early, landed the tank safely in a field, and drove it back to base still wearing its wings. Startled airfield guards detained him, convinced this winged tank was a German secret weapon. The project was cancelled because no available Soviet aircraft could handle the tow load. The Germans took the opposite approach entirely. Rather than making vehicles fly, they built enormous gliders to carry vehicles inside. The Messerschmitt Me 321 Gigant had a 180-foot wingspan and could swallow a Panzer IV medium tank or an 88mm gun with its half-track. But the Gigant was so heavy, it initially required 3 Bf-110 fighters in a dangerous formation tow called the Troika Schlepp, and later the purpose-built HE-111 Zwilling twin-fuselage aircraft. The Germans did also experiment with autorotation. The Fokker Achilles F-225 fitted an unpowered rotor to a DFS-230 troop glider in exactly the same principle Hafner used, but Germany never applied that concept to vehicles. They tested it only as an alternative to fixed-wing gliders for delivering troops. The Americans relied on mass-produced Waco CG-4A Hadrian gliders during the war. Over 13,900 were built. Each could carry a jeep and passengers, towed by the ubiquitous C-47 Dakota. The US returned to the flying jeep concept only in the late 1950s, with the Piasecki FivZ-8 Air Jeep, a purpose-built platform with ducted rotors that could actually hover. The Army abandoned it in 1962, concluding the concept was unsuitable for the modern battlefield. The British approach stood apart from all three. Hafner proposed modifying an existing abundant vehicle with a cheap rotary wing attachment. The Soviets were more ambitious but impractical. The Germans simply built bigger. The Americans mass-produced disposable gliders and only revisited the concept with Cold War-era technology. Only the British attempted the elegant low-cost middle ground. The Rotabuggy was not cancelled because it failed. It was cancelled because conventional gliders succeeded well enough. By September 1944, D-Day was 3 months past. Over 300 Horsa gliders had delivered troops and equipment to Normandy. Hamilcar gliders had put Tetrarch tanks on French soil. The Waco Hadrian had delivered 281 jeeps across the invasion beaches. Operation Market Garden and Operation Varsity proved that mass-produced gliders, however wasteful per unit, provided a proven and scalable system. Against this, the Rotabuggy offered theoretical cost savings but appalling handling, a terrifying pilot experience, and a payload limited to 1 jeep with 2 crew. No passengers, no ammunition, no anti-tank gun alongside. A Horsa could deliver a jeep plus crew plus trailer plus equipment in a single package. The Hamilcar could deliver a 7-ton Tetrarch tank. The war was also approaching its end, removing the urgency that had driven Hafner's unconventional thinking in the first place. The project was officially shelved in late 1944. The prototype had its rotor and tail removed, and reports suggest the Jeep was reused by the establishment for general ground duties at RAF Beaulieu. The Rotabuggy's real legacy was not the flying Jeep itself, but the career it launched. Raoul Hafner joined the Bristol Aeroplane Company in late 1944 as chief designer of a new helicopter division. He designed the Bristol Type 171 Sycamore, the first British helicopter to receive a civil certificate of airworthiness and the first manufactured in series for the RAF. He went on to develop the Type 192 Belvedere tandem rotor helicopter, which he named after the Belvedere Palace near his childhood home in Vienna. When Westland Aircraft absorbed Bristol's helicopter business in 1960, Hafner became technical director. He received the Alexander Clemmen Award in 1953 and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Hafner's wartime rotary wing research, born from bolting a rotor to a jeep, fed directly into Britain's post-war helicopter industry. No original Rotabuggy components are known to survive. The prototype was scrapped after its time in the motor pool. A full-scale replica, built by the Wessex Aviation Society from a modified Willys Jeep, is displayed at the Army Flying Museum at Middle Wallop, Hampshire. It sits alongside an original surviving rotor chute, the very device that proved the autorotation principle before Hafner scaled it up to Jeep size. Squadron Leader Little, the man who survived the flight, received the Air Force Cross for courage in test flying. He later became one of Britain's leading development economists at Oxford, a Fellow of All Souls College, and a CBE. In his privately published autobiography Little by Little, he compared himself to a sort of James Bond trying out Q's inventions, and somewhere out there, legend has it, is a supercharged 4.5-litre Blower Bentley that may once have been logged as an aircraft by the Royal Air Force. It was reportedly used as a runabout by AFEE after the trials, then returned to a dealership post-war. Nobody knows where it ended up. If that car still exists, it may be the only Bentley in history that can claim to have towed a flying jeep across a Yorkshire airfield, while a photographer sat in the back seat and a man in the passenger seat of the Jeep behind it held on for his life. If you happen to own a pre-war supercharged Bentley with inexplicably worn toe fittings and traces of RAF paperwork in its history, do get in touch. The Rotabuggy proved that a standard military Jeep could genuinely fly under autorotation. It reached 400 feet. It sustained flight for 10 minutes. It proved that British engineers could look at a problem everyone else solved with brute force and find a cheaper, lighter, more elegant answer. The Soviets strapped wings to a tank and overheated the towplane. The Germans built gliders so enormous they needed 3 fighters to drag them aloft. The Americans mass-produced 13,000 disposable wooden airframes. The British bolted a rotor to a Jeep and towed it behind a Bentley. The concept was aerodynamically real, but operationally unacceptable in its current form. The engineering was sound. The aerodynamic data Hafner gathered fed directly into rotary wing research that shaped British helicopter design for decades. And the man behind it went on to build the helicopters that helped accelerate Britain's post-war rotary wing capability, gradually displacing many of the roles gliders had filled. That is the British approach to warfare. Take an impossible idea, make it work, and if the first version tries to shake itself apart in mid-air, send up a Bentley and try again.